Welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am your co-host, Brian Berletic. Joining me, as always, is Angelo Giuliano. Welcome again. Today, we're going to go over some news items. The U.S.-Russian summit. We're going to be talking about the U.S. and G7 and their plans to build back a better world. And then our main topic is going to be U.S. provocations against China over Taiwan. And I think people will see how all of these issues are interlinked. So let's take a look at our first news story. This is from CNN. 5 takeaways from the summit between Biden and Putin. And I've followed some commentary. Maybe you have seen some commentary also, Angelo, about this. People are talking about how it was civilized, how it looks like ties between the U.S. and Russia may have slightly improved, but this is all superficial, isn't it? And well, first of all, what's your first impression on all of this, Angelo?
I think it's very simple. I would say just nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. I think Putin's expectation were not high. I think he had very low expectations. And keep in mind, we are at rock bottom relationship between the US and Russia. So it couldn't go any lower. It could go just higher. I mean, just the single fact that they're meeting, you could call it an improvement of relationship. But in reality, absolutely nothing happened. And keep in mind that the meeting lasted only 2.5 hours. What are you expecting to achieve? And there was no plan. Usually you have a plan. You want to achieve something. There's an agenda and what you want to achieve and nothing. What came out? Did you see any agreement? Nothing. So CNN is working very hard on saying, well, what are the achievements and so on. For me, it was just a PR action from Biden just to let the world know that, I'm back, and it's just empty. It's all empty. It was embarrassing. You could see Putin just being very nice. I mean, you know how Putin is, just being very nice. And then the contrast, Biden just answering to questions only to Western medias, and they were all planned. While Putin was taking all questions and every single question asked to Putin were like condemnations. Every time, when you come to say, you say, Navalny, the oppression, freedom of speech and so on. Well, you know what? Freedom of speech, we saw it. Putin was taking any questions while Biden wasn't. That's just freedom of speech.
That's actually isn't that a little bit sort of like a form of censorship where you're not even giving people the opportunity to speak their minds or to ask their questions? That's a very interesting point. And some people talking about how this was civilized, how it looks like it might mark maybe a slight turning point between U.S. and Russian relations. I just want to kind of point out to people that the last time the U.S. pretended to be friendly toward Russia was back in, I think it was 2009. Let's take a look at this article here. It was 2009, and people might remember then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton giving Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov this reset button. And this was supposed to symbolize the U.S. and Russia resetting their relations because when the Cold War ended, the U.S. pretended that they were going to, build this friendship and constructive relationship with the Russian Federation. What they did was try to strip mine the country. And as President Vladimir Putin came to power, consolidated Russia's position and started to reemerge, that the U.S. was not interested in friendship. They wanted to finish strip mining the country and integrating it into what they call their international order. And while Hillary Clinton was putting on this show, this very same year, she was already in the process of preparing the ground along with everyone else in the U.S. government for the 2011 Arab Spring, which was ultimately aimed at collapsing friendly countries to Russia in the region, from North Africa to the Middle East, but then also eventually collapsing the Iranian government and then having hordes of terrorists armed by the US sitting on Russia's southern border across the Caucasus Mountains. And we'll go into that a little bit deeper. Angelo, what about this reset? And then when you see the US pretending to be friendly with Russia, knowing that they're still in Syria specifically to spite Russia, and the situation in Ukraine, the fact that we just heard Karl Gershman at the NED admit that they're behind the opposition inside of Russia. What do you think when you see people falling for this US becoming friendly with Russia?
Yeah, we shouldn't be fooled by appearance, those PR activities. Remember, I'll take the example of when Nixon met with Mao. The US had been, the CIA had been funding the Dalai Lama already for 10 years. And at the same time, they were receiving in the White House, they were receiving Alptekin, which was the father of the founder of the independence movement in Xinjiang. So they were already planning how we can destroy China. How we could do a balkanization of China. So you see, they saying, "Oh, this is our new friend or brother," and so on. But it's just they are ready to stab you on the back.
That is a really good point. That is a very good comparison. Okay, well, I wanted to point this out, that Russia fought two wars in its southern region, Chechnya, near the Caucasus Mountains, and obviously the US was behind the militants. They were behind the militants in Afghanistan, fighting the Soviets in the 80s. And of course, if there was a militancy inside of Russia with many of these same sort of militants, of course the US would be sponsoring them. And Russia has even said this, and even the US to a certain extent has admitted to this. I want to point out something else, that the Arab Spring wasn't just a coincidence or spontaneous. It was meticulously planned by the US years in advance. And then as it was unfolding, we actually had US senators like John McCain saying that the Arab Spring was a virus that will attack Moscow and Beijing. That was the whole point. It was to destabilize the region and further encircle both of these nations, and then eventually target the nations directly themselves. We saw that more recently with Hong Kong, and we're going to talk about Taiwan as well later in this episode. But this particular point about Moscow, I wrote this article. This was from 2012, and there's still a lot of people confused about what was going on in Libya and Syria at that point. And I pointed out how, just looking at the history of US encirclement and containment of Russia and what they were doing at the time, it was very obvious where this was all headed. We had Libya already collapsed at that point, 2012. Egypt and Mali was having these problems, and all of this was being destabilized because of Libya's collapse. And we saw Syria and Iraq, and we knew that the whole point of that was to eventually topple Iran. If you look at the map, you can see that is southern Russia. That is Chechnya and the Caucasus Mountains. There's Azerbaijan right on Russia's border. And if we looked at this BBC article, they actually talk about how Russia was saying Azerbaijan played a role in the US-backed militancy in Chechnya. And then think back to last year when Azerbaijan and Armenia had that conflict, that arms conflict, and Turkey sided with Azerbaijan. They brought in Syrian fighters that Turkey and the US were backing in Syria, and they brought those mercenaries into Azerbaijan to fight Armenia. Right? That was right on Russia's border. And where's the other article? I think it's this one from Reuters. So this is this month. This is just a couple of days ago. Russia monitoring talk of Turkish military base in Azerbaijan. So we can see the US pretending to be friendly with Russia, and then we can see Turkey, a NATO member, working with the US to destabilize Syria, but now bringing Syrian terrorists to Azerbaijan on Russia's border, and now they're talking about building a military base. Do people see that this is them continuing the Arab Spring? The original intention of the Arab Spring was to threaten Russia on its southern border, and then Moscow itself. What do you think about that? That's that theory, Angelo.
You can see the direction is going towards Russia. It's getting closer. It's an encirclement of Russia in China. I think the plan of the US it was much slower. It took too much time. Since 9/11, I think it started, roughly, I mean, even before, Afghanistan, and there's a shift, like they were funding terrorists back then, Bin Laden and so on. But I think it took too much time, and they spent too much money too. The resources the US put into Afghanistan, Iraq, and it didn't go as they expected. You see, now Iraq is democratic, but you had the majority of the politicians, they voted for withdrawal of the US. It didn't go as they planned. When they become democracy, don't expect them to be pro US. So it's going towards the direction of encircling China and Russia. But the problem is that 20 years have passed. In 20 years, China is much, much stronger. So now it's impossible. You cannot imagine a confrontation direct with China and the US. What they need to find is proxy. They need to find the useful idiots. And in this case, the war, the ultimate war between China and the US is going to be through Taiwan. That's my opinion. That is the most sensitive place.
And then it's great that we're going to be talking about that and getting into that. And also Russia is a much more confident and stronger country than 20 years ago. And Russia's ability to intervene in Syria on behalf of the government there and basically stop US regime change operations, block US military intervention, which they tried once again to predicate on weapons of mass destruction. And so we see them kind of doing this light version of what I think they initially wanted to do. And it's just as you said, it was too little, too late. They wanted to do this sweeping campaign across the region and get it over with quickly. And then I think Libya took a little longer than they thought it would. And then I think Syria did. And that article with John McCain talking about the virus of the Arab Spring attacking Moscow and Beijing, he even said that by this time next year, Assad would be out of power. Assad's still in power. Where's John McCain?
He's never been so popular. I think Assad has never been so popular. He was not that popular maybe at some point, but because he united, he was the only person that could actually maintain stability and sovereignty of Syria. People just realized that he was the solution. And so keep in mind, those revolutions can work only if they act really quickly. You have a mass of information, fake information, that are debunked over time. So you need to have a quick revolution so people don't have time to realize what is right, what is wrong, And so if it's not done quickly, it doesn't happen. Same as what happened in Hong Kong. So much misinformation. Now, 2 years later, everybody realized, we've been manipulated. Protesters were paid. So much just come out, but it takes time. The same is happening in Syria. You see, all the investigation about supposedly Assad gassing its own people, all fake, completely fake.
Yes, and they tried it multiple times, and now there's just so much suspicion when the U.S. says anything like this. It's an old trick, and it just doesn't work anymore. So
yes,
speaking of,
remember.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
Libya, just adding one more thing, because it was big in Libya. They were talking about 10,000 people died, and at the end they counted like 25 people. 25 people, and they were saying like the huge massacre, 10,000 people died. And everybody was reporting that, nobody questioning.
And then there was that documentary where they interviewed the fake human rights advocates funded by the U.S. government, working with the U.S. government to overthrow the Libyan government. And they admitted that they made up all the numbers, that there was no way to confirm any of it. And he didn't even care. He had no regret or anything. This was after everything was over and the country was destroyed. Zero remorse. So people that have fake human rights groups like this in their country, just remember that they don't care what happens. They're getting paid. they live comfortable lives. They will be insulated from the consequences. And then speaking of old tricks or tricks that aren't working, let's talk about America and the G7 tagging along their answer to China's One Belt, One Road initiative. And they're calling it Build Back Better World, B3W. And I was talking to you about this right before the show. It's not even proper English. And they could have called it Building Back a Better World, and they could have still had the acronym, but they just, for some reason, decided to do this. And it's just kind of indicative of the entire initiative. They're talking about making all of this infrastructure, but when you search through this document, I read the whole thing, and I did searches, keyword searches. You don't see anything about bridges, roads, railways, pipelines, ports, airports. You don't see anything, any specific tangible example of infrastructure. And the other thing that popped out to me was this: the agencies the US is going to mobilize to do this. And even though they sound like they're development agencies, they're not, and we know they're not. And we're going to go over that here in a minute. And the ones that should pop out the most is USAID, and then this one, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which I had to look up. I wasn't really familiar with that, but we're going to look at the website. But Angelo, when you looked at this, what did you think about this proposal? I mean, how did it initially strike you?
I think it's all empty slogans. I'll take the example of a real project, very tangible, and it's not walking the talk. China, look at what happened in China. I saw it started, we see now the Belt and Road Initiative, but this was started already 30 years ago. There was a 5-year plan, maybe 25 years ago, which was to how we can raise the standard of living of the western regions, keeping in mind that there was a huge gap between the coastal regions, which were very rich, Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, and you had very poor regions, which are Tibet, Gansu, Xinjiang. So they started investing, pulling a lot of money and starting to build up some infrastructure. And then they started building, railways, high-speed railways. And so build internally the railways, very solid, extremely fast. And then Belt and Road Initiative, you go outside. What the US has at the moment is an economy which is a disaster, a huge trade deficit. So basically, it's just using the US dollar hegemony just to spending money. And if it wasn't for the hegemony of the US dollar hegemony, it wouldn't be sustainable. So you have a huge deficit of infrastructure already in the US. They need trillions of dollars to be spent not outside, but inside the US. You built your own house after you build the roads. They want to build the whole road first after building their own house. No, it doesn't make any sense. Infrastructure is very important. Yes. Someone used to say, if you want to get rich, build a road. Chinese, they understood that. They understood that already a long time ago. The Silk Road, existed already because they had a vision. If you build roads, you can do trade. You make the world smaller and much more efficient. So what this B3W, what is it? It's just empty slogans, just empty. And they're playing the followers, actually. Why don't you come up with something more original? You're playing the follower. You've been criticizing the Belt and Road Initiative, and you are spending, the US is spending through USAGM around $300 million a year just to demonize the Belt and Road Initiative. So you spend a lot of money to demonize China and the Belt and Road Initiative, and you're trying to do something similar. It's just desperate. It's a desperate move, and it's just marketing. I'm just surprised they didn't do a logo on the B3W. Usually they use this as marketing. It's just a marketing product. They put you in the face, and after the next election, people forget. Because this is what people do. They just forget. Oh, well, forget.
And before this, about 2 years ago, they unveiled the Blue Dot Network, which was a very similar concept. They did actually have a logo, but what have we heard from the Blue Dot Network since? And then they just kind of threw it into here. This fact sheet. They kind of just lumped it in there, and then they're just throwing all of this out there. When you look at this, this is nonsense. Value-driven, good governance and strong standards, climate-friendly, strong strategic partnerships. They're not actually talking about any infrastructure. And let's go to Wikipedia, which is Western propaganda, is not an encyclopedia. And I heard one person say that it's basically the public bathroom wall of the internet, where anyone could just write anything. But here's the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the entry for it. You see an actual map of all of the ongoing projects. And if you come down here, there's the background, there's the financing, then there's the infrastructure networks, and these all have their own entries. These are all projects that are already completed and in operation and connecting entire regions of the planet together. And then you come down and there's the additionally proposed. Then you just take a look at this. These are some of the most populous countries on Earth involved in this. And then I pointed this also out to you before, the reactions and criticism support. There's over 130 countries that support this or are involved in this. And then under opposition, the United States. It's just kind of, this is Wikipedia too. This is supposed to paint everything the West does in a positive light. Let's take a look at the Wikipedia entry for Build Back Better World. It's barely a paragraph. And just like you said, they don't even bother with a logo. There's no map. There's no example of any infrastructure project at all. And what I wanted to point out of USAID and all these other supposed development agencies, USAID doesn't do actual development. They don't build roads and bridges and power plants. They don't do stuff like that. They flood countries with money, usually to block infrastructure projects. Myanmar is a perfect example of how they did this. They give the bare necessities to these villages so they don't feel they need to depend on the central government. They encourage separatism, and then they give them money to block highways and dam projects and ports and everything like that. And I'm going to go into the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Angelo, what do you think about that?
Yeah. You're right about USAID. 50% is humanitarian for USAID, because of course you need to do something humanitarian, but 50% is poured into what they call civil society. But what do they mean by civil society? Is funding the opposition or just for regime change, just all along, it's just a facade, and it's just a bit better than an NED. I just want to add something about why the US hasn't been spending much into infrastructure. It's very simple. I come from the finance industry, and we have a ratio which is called return on investment. So in order to have a high ratio of return on investment, you need to have low investment. It's just, pure mathematics. So this is why you have companies like Nestle, for example. They sell all their factories, and at the end, it's just a marketing company. So Wall Street is ruling the US. So they are trained only in terms of return on investment. So do the least investment possible. Send it to China. Sell your infrastructure to, all those factories that were sent to China. It was just to please Wall Street. And at the end, you end up in a country which is completely dependent on China, and who doesn't know how to build basic stuff because you outsource it. In one generation, things that was very simple to be made in the US, they won't know how to do it. So you see, I think in some ways Trump was right. We need to be independent. And that I agree with that. But the thing is that, it's just too late. Now they're dependent on China, and you're a culprit. It's your fault. It's not China's fault. China, you got addicted to pay low prices in China, and they made your life very easy. And the thing is that, it's just too late. Now they're dependent on China, and you're a culprit. It's not China's fault. China, you got addicted to pay low prices in China, and they made your life very easy. And the thing is that, it's just too late. Now they're dependent on China, and you got addicted to pay low prices in China, and they made your life very easy. And at the end, they end up doing the things that you were doing. They take up your job. Yeah, that's the reality. But it's your fault. That's Wall Street. That's not China's fault. That's not China's fault. So the
Yes.
thing is that this is why in the US, they relinquish a lot to invest into solid infrastructure. Because it's about having the highest ratio. Invest the least possible and you have the highest profit. And that is why the service industry have those ratios, but not whatever is related to industry, building product.
Yes, and it was always profit before purpose. There was no purpose. It was just this blind, mindless pursuit of endless profit. And I want to kind of add to what you were saying about U.S. aid. This document here is a U.S. government Joint Chiefs of Staff counterinsurgency manual. And if you type in U.S. aid, you see up here there's 40. It's mentioned by name 40 times. This is because USAID is not a development organization. It is used to consolidate control over a country. When they talk about counterinsurgency, all throughout this manual, they're talking about the US backing a client regime in some country that the people that live there don't want and want out of power, like say in Iraq in the beginning of the occupation. And it's all about how they use USAID to consolidate control over the country. It has nothing to do with development and building a self-sufficient, independent country with modern infrastructure. That's nowhere in here at all. And so it's very important for people to keep that in mind. And the other thing I wanted to point out was this Millennium Challenge Corporation. And on their front page, this story, social inclusion in MCC's Mongolia Compact, affordable water for all in Ulaanbaatar. And you're thinking like, well, they'll have pictures of building water pipes and maybe like water towers and treatment plants. But then when you go through here, it's just this lady and whoever's taking pictures of her going around doing a survey so that they can pressure policymakers. There's no mention at all of any sort of infrastructure at all. And as I said, WikiLeaks, I pointed this out many times, that this is the US Embassy admitting in places like Myanmar that they fund organizations to oppose infrastructure projects like dams in Myanmar that would create electricity. So do you have anything to add before we go to the next topic, which this is actually related to the next topic, but do you have any last thoughts on this Build Back Better World initiative?
Well, just to go back to infrastructure, imagine how important it is for a country like Myanmar to have infrastructure. Infrastructure, you will have more trade, you will have better connections. You have 135 minorities, and you have lots of those minorities which are fighting the central government, but they are there high up in the jungle. They're not connected. And I mean, what the country needs to be reunited is connection. And so they desperately need infrastructure, dams for electricity and so on. So what the US is doing there is just keep on dividing and not building some basic prosperity. Again, you have those human rights, but you have also those environmental NGOs that are going to Myanmar and saying, well, you know what, we want you to keep like the flora and everything the way Westerners want, But again, they don't care about Burmese people from Myanmar having food on the table. This is basic rights. Those are basic rights. Access to education, having food. So we want those people to stay colonized and stay poor. That's what the US wants.
I think you put it perfectly. The US is a modern day empire. They do not want to develop a country, because a developed country with modern infrastructure is going to end up independent of whatever the US wants. It's going to be able to make its own decisions. So that's exactly what the goal is here, is to divide and keep them poor and infighting. And that's what the Build Back Better World actually is. It's just rebranding behind which they're going to continue blocking development, not driving development. And when they accuse China of being an empire, well, China is doing the worst thing possible for an empire to be doing, is building all of this infrastructure in other countries that's going to empower these countries. It's going to create a balance of power in the world that is going to make empire increasingly difficult, if not impossible. And the US is finding that out the hard way, aren't they? And this leads in perfectly to this next topic, which is the US meddling in Taiwan, trying to turn it into a battering ram against China. And this whole issue, underlining this issue, is this process of China surpassing the US and America's inability to compete. And why they're trying to compete in this way also, is, to me, is completely irrational. But let's just take a look at what they're talking about. Pushing against China, US lawmakers plan pro-Taiwan bill. And if you come down here, it's called the Taiwan Peace and Stability Act. And what they're actually really trying to do is continue to insidiously promote independence in Taiwan. And people might not realize this, but Taiwan is not a country. It is part of China under the One China policy, which is recognized by virtually every country on Earth, including officially the United States, which does not have an embassy in Taiwan because it's not a country. Why would they have an embassy there? Angelo, you are in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is kind of like a miniature version of what the US and its allies are trying to do in Taiwan. Taiwan is a much bigger Western foothold within Chinese territory. What do you think about this?
Well, what the US did with Hong Kong was they did as much as they could to destroy the one country, two system. For China, one country, two system in Hong Kong was a good way to show Taiwan that one country, two system could work in Taiwan. So they did everything. So a lot of people, they were focusing on Hong Kong and so on, but for China, it was the end goal was to get Taiwan back to China under one country, two system. So it was all in the interest of the US to destroy the one country, two system, and to demonize China, further demonize China. So you had a big shift in the opinion in Taiwan, where you have the DPP, which is pro-US and for pro-independence, that actually won because of the 2019 riots in Hong Kong. And they were actually, the DPP was actually bringing support, logistic and financial support to the rioters. So you see, this is all linked. When it comes to Taiwan independence, you have a roughly 50% that are strongly opposed to that. It's 50% of Taiwanese. Keeping in mind also that you have around 2 million Taiwanese that live in the mainland. And those 2 million Taiwanese, they love China united. And so when you look at the profile of those Taiwanese living for the mainland, we are talking about the biggest brain. I mean, the brains, entrepreneur, the best of Taiwan is in the mainland. And the quality of life is so much better now. So I think before anything, there won't be a big shift towards independence. I think politicians are still going to be pragmatic, and they want to play. They're going to play both sides. What is important is to keep the status quo, because if there is one red line, is Taiwan. Keeping in mind that Taiwan hasn't been reunited with China for 100 years. Before the move of the Kuomintang to Taiwan, Taiwan was colonized 50 years by the Japanese. So we talking about really those 100 years of humiliation. And if China wants to finally close this humiliation, it's going to be through Taiwan. Once Taiwan is reunited with the mainland, then China will finally make peace with its history.
All very good points. And when we hear about this, the U.S. is always trying to suggest that someday China is just going to invade Taiwan and just snatch it up. And this is their justification, at least partial justification of their continued military presence all across the Indo-Pacific region. They sail their fleets through the strait, and we see also, in addition to this Taiwan bill, this Ensuring American Global Leadership and Engagement Act, the EAGLE Act, they're calling it. And this is to boost economic competitiveness and push China on human rights. But ensuring American global leadership is the US saying that they will not accept China surpassing them, even though it is completely irrational. And I say this very often, and I'm going to say it again. China has 4 to 5 times the population as the US. They have access to plenty of natural resources. They have a hardworking, well-educated population. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at this. This is from Forbes. And this is the number of STEM graduates per year. This was in 2016. It's 4.7 million from China, and it's about 500,000, a little more than 500,000 in the United States. These STEM graduates, these are people that are going to go into the economy. They're going to be spurring technological innovation. They're going to be working at factories, overseeing manufacturing and the building of infrastructure in China and beyond. There is no way the US is going to be able to compete with this. This gap only grows because of China's population and because of the development that is happening in China. There's no way that China is not going to surpass the US. And the US rationally should look at the facts. Like, if all people are equal, this is something the US always pushes, human equality. If people are all equal, the country with more people, if they're well educated and have access to plenty of resources, they're going to surpass you. And you need to find your place within that world instead of trying to put yourself above it irrationally and against all actual features of reality where China is and will be ahead. There's more to this, but Angelo, do you want to react to that?
I think this picture tells you so much about the culture. You know, there was a survey in the US. They were asking kids what you dream about when you are going to be older, when you are going to be an adult. And you know, the majority, the number one position in the US was a YouTuber. You know, in China, it's an astronaut. You saw those surveys tells you a lot. We just saw the figures just before. Of course, China population is bigger, so you should have much more STEM graduates. But again, if you take it per capita, you have 2 times more STEM graduate in China, and the same with Russia. Russia is the same level of STEM graduates, but the US has 2 times the population of Russia. So you see, the thing is that it's those countries, they teach their kids to build things. You know, lawyers, bankers, what are they doing? You know, people in the West, they are told. And also, when you look at salaries, the level of salaries of lawyers and bankers is much higher in the US. In China, if you go to China, engineers and bankers have roughly the same salary. So it's about incentives, and it's about building tangible assets. How much you contribute when you are a lawyer, how much you contribute to society, and how much you contribute when you are into engineering. You know, you are going to build trains, you are going to send people to space, and that is what China is doing. If you look at the space program of China, the next 30 years, it is mind-blowing, and it's just going exponential. It's going exponential because they're putting, you know, their wallet where you know they follow with what they say. You know, it's just not empty talk. They say they are going to Jupiter. You know, they're talking about going to Jupiter. You know, sending some, you know, and they will do it. Tell me one time where China didn't make any plan and didn't deliver. It's impossible. They have to deliver. And this is why you have this contract between the state and the people. As long as the state is delivering to people, people are happy. At least my leaders didn't lie. It's not about making empty promises, and once you're elected, it's completely the opposite. And it's always like elect and regret. No, in China, you can have this one-party politics as long as you deliver. You make promises, you are competent, you deliver, people are happy. That's all people are asking for.
all good points. And just recently, China just put 3 of its astronauts up into space to board their new space station that they are building themselves, because the U.S. excluded them from the so-called International Space Station. And because U.S.-Russian ties are deteriorating, Russia is going to join with China. So what you were talking about space, this isn't something that is going to happen in the near future. They're already doing it. They're already sending their own astronauts into space. They have their own space station. They have a private space industry that is also innovating at a very fast pace. So this is for real. And let's go back to here. So this all ties into the Taiwan issue, because with this backdrop, this is what the U.S. is trying to do. They're still trying to influence this control over Taiwan. And if you go to the U.S. government's own International Trade Administration website, Taiwan Country Commercial Guide, they talk about U.S. trade with Taiwan.
If you go up in percentage, we are talking about the U.S. as only half of the percentage that China has in terms of
yes.
Taiwan.
Yeah, right here.
So you know, when they talk about inclusion of Taiwan with China, actually Taiwan is de facto reunited with China just because most of the trade is with China. Taiwan is complete. You know, like when you look at the owners of factories in China, the biggest investors, you know, are Taiwanese. You know, when there was the opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping, the capital they came from Japan, came from Hong Kong, but mostly from Taiwan. So you have all those factory owners are all Taiwanese. So you have a de facto integration of Taiwan already in Chinese economy. You cannot undo this. It's impossible.
Yes, and if we're looking at this, this is from Harvard University, Atlas of Economic Complexity, a very useful tool. And we can look at, this is 2018, where did Taiwan export to in 2018? 33.53% to China and 10.48%. This is not insignificant, but it's very clear that Taiwan has a much closer economic relationship to China. And why wouldn't it? It's right off the coast of the mainland. Why wouldn't they? And it's the same story for imports. Go ahead, Angelo.
Yeah, we should just add, you know, sometimes you tend to see Hong Kong, you know, just before, if you add China and Hong Kong, actually, every time, whenever we analyze this, we need to take them together. The reason is very simple, because Hong Kong goods don't necessarily go directly to Hong Kong. They buy to Hong Kong. Hong Kong is used as a trading platform for tax issues. So those 11%, probably more than half of this is going to China. So you see, you have 44%, and then you have 10% the US. Actually, it is 4 times. It's massive, and we are not even counting. We're not even counting. Those are physical goods. If you were to count, what you call, you know, travel industry. You know, the service industry, like travelers, mainland travelers going to Taiwan, that would be much more.
Yes, and the reason why I like this tool is because they have a little timeline down here, and you can actually get a snapshot of what this looked like 10 years ago. So let's look 10 years ago. China and the United States. Oops, no, we're still doing by partner. And here, where did Taiwan import from? China and the US at that time were kind of close, weren't they? And Japan was actually the big player. And if we go back 20 years or so, you can see China was barely, you know, it's such a small share. And the United States had such a big share. So that was 20 years ago. And then back to more recently, you can see how the dynamics have completely flipped around 180 degrees, and how the U.S. is at such a disadvantage. And as we were just talking, this is not something the U.S. is going to wave its hands around with a B3W initiative and suddenly turn around again. This is it. This is the end game. China and Taiwan, just like you said, and again, like keep in mind that Hong Kong is part of China also. This is irreversible. This is the irreversible decline of U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific region, which is why they're getting so nasty with the different things that they're trying to do. And just think about it, and I want you to comment on this, Angelo, because I think this is a very important point for the people of Taiwan. Who is going to benefit from the U.S. sending them weapons and encouraging independence and presumably encourage or get Taiwan to do what Australia is doing, to cut economic ties with the mainland just to spite Beijing and to please Washington? Who's going to benefit from any of that? And then inevitably, they're still going to get reintegrated as the Chinese people determine. So what do you think about that?
I would actually tell those Taiwanese that are daydreaming. It's not dreaming. This is daydreaming. It's just it's an illusion. They're hoping for independence. Just why don't they learn about what happened in Maidan 2014, Maidan revolution in Ukraine? The US did spend $4 to $5 billion US just for regime change. It was a democratic elected government, and he wanted to shift from Russia's sphere to US sphere. They promised a lot of investment and integration with Europe. You would be able to travel freely to Europe and so on. Now it didn't happen. They cannot go freely to Europe. There was Nord Stream. They used to get $3 billion US of transit fee. With Nord Stream 2, they won't get that. You look at the last 10 years, the economy in Ukraine is completely destroyed. The main partner was Russia, and you cannot undo that. So they received lots of empty promise. The US never delivered, and they're gonna drop you. They used you, and they're gonna drop you. So now it's over. Ukraine, it is over. You need to talk again with Putin, and you need to mend all those differences. So they're going to do the same. Do you think that Americans care about Taiwan? The US government, they don't. It's a very good tool. It's a tool. They're just trying to, find the useful idiots that is going to be the traitors. Traitors, they forget that, they need to think in terms of their own interest. But I just hope that, Taiwanese, they know that they're being used, and they can play both sides as long as they keep the status quo. But going to war, that would be the worst case scenario. And again, Taiwan could be taken in 2 weeks. In 2 weeks it could be taken. But the price you pay, nobody wins. And the brothers, Chinese, they really care about Taiwanese. They're doing everything they can now to send vaccines. Imagine now Taiwanese, the DPP is refusing vaccines. We'd rather have our people die, but politically, we don't want us to lose face. No, you need to think about you people. And now my question is, does Europe, does the US, are they sending vaccines to Taiwan? No. They have huge stocks in the UK. They have 3 times vaccines, the amount of vaccines they need. Are they sending anything to Taiwan? Do they care about Taiwan? No, they don't. But China is willing just to help Taiwan. They would do anything to help Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that is a good point to make, and especially about the prospect of the mainland using military force against Taiwan. When we see the economic game and the integration and the inevitability of further integration, as long as China is patient and avoids the provocations. And I want to show this one last thing. This is the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And if that kind of sounds familiar, it's because it's a franchise of the US government's National Endowment for Democracy. As a matter of fact, they even have their own page about the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And so people who think that the Taiwanese genuinely want independence, how true is that? And how much is that them coming to that conclusion themselves? And how much of it is a product of this insidious foreign interference by the US government in Taiwan's internal political affairs through organizations like this. It's just so, to me, it's just so obvious that they're using Taiwan as a battering ram, just like they used the protesters in Hong Kong. They made all kinds of assurances and promises to them as well about what would happen after the protests were over, and they didn't honor any of those promises. And I said that Hong Kong is kind of like a miniature version of what's going on with Taiwan, this attempt by the US to use it as a pressure point against Beijing. And that's their only interest in either location. So why do people in Taiwan think that somehow they are going to be the exception to this behavior the US has demonstrated all around the globe over decades and decades? This isn't like a phase they're going through. Angelo, any last thoughts? Because I think this would be a good place to kind of wrap it up.
Yeah, I would just talk about just education and the profile of who are supporting the independence. It's the same as in Hong Kong. The young people, they've never experienced the country under occupation, the colonial system. So there's a huge gap. They were brainwashed by Hollywood. They are brainwashed by an idea of what the US is, not about what the US is. It's an idea. The reality is very different. So it's always a gap of that is due to ignorance. Most of them haven't left Taiwan. They're not international. They've been staying in the island. The ones that went to mainland China, we're talking about 2 million Taiwanese living in mainland China. They are pro integration of Taiwan with the mainland. It's always about the ignorance level, and they are probably part of the kind of local losers of the globalization. They are there, like parts of Taiwan, especially the South, is still very poor. It's not very linked to the outside world. So this is how you build up some kind of nationalism. Protect ourselves. Build up a fear of while they shouldn't be afraid of China. And it's easier to do that with kids. Kids are easily manipulated, especially at the emotional level, not the rational level. Because when it comes to rational, people start to read books, they learn about history, and they learn about their roots. And once you know that, you realize, we've been colonized by Japan. Now kids in Taiwan, they worship Japan. They worship Japan. And their parents, they tell them, well, you should just learn about history. We've been colonized by Japan for 50 years. 50 years. But people have a short attention span. They just it's just going too fast. They don't take the time to sit down and learn about history and look for facts.
And these young people in Taiwan favoring independence and going along with this US-backed narrative, they are part of the so-called Milk Tea Alliance, which, as I pointed out, is an obvious US State Department project. And it's all part of creating anarchic chaos and instability all along China's peripheries and inside China as well. So I think we've discussed a lot. I think we've given people a lot to think about on this topic. It's something that's going to continuously come up because, like I said, this is one of their last pressure points within Chinese territory that they could keep pushing on. And they're going to continue because we just saw with the B3W, they don't have an answer to what's going on. They have no answer for maintaining primacy. They don't even understand why that's irrational to even pursue as an objective, as a foreign policy objective. I think this is a good place to wrap it up. As always, Angelo, thank you very much for joining me and sharing your insight. I really appreciate that. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and for supporting us. Really appreciate that as well. And we'll see you next time.